They're not harmlessly and peacefully making their views heard. They are violently preventing people from accessing healthcare.
Welcome to today's Lie Fest in the Scottish Parliament. Now, this debate is about, again, the buffer zones, the vigils that are held at abortion clinics, and the groups trying to justify getting a legal ban on these sort of peaceful, quiet protests that don't approach anyone, deal with people very graciously, etc. But they're trying to demonise them in order to get a law against them, standing there in order to communicate and to be there to anyone who wants to talk to them. So let's have a look at what's going to go on in this debate. Now, in this debate, we hear from quite a few of the new MSPs. Now, before the election, a lot of the previous MSPs stood down, so there are a lot of new ones coming into the Parliament. And I heard a few people say they're a bit worried, because they thought the new ones coming in will probably be even worse, even more radically progressive, secular liberal than the ones who'd stood down. Judging by this video, their fears were grounded. Anyway, let's go over to one of the new Green MSPs.
A small group of individuals, mostly male, were standing on the other side of the road. I was repeatedly called out to by one of the men, and when I glared at him and ignored him, he called me a teenage murderer.
Right, that happened allegedly at the Chalmers Clinic in Edinburgh. That's the vigil that I've been along to a couple of times. I know a lot of the people involved in it. In fact, my wife organised it. The probability of that story being true is in the region of zero. In the region of zero. I just don't believe it. Now, if you're campaigning for something and all you have to do is like make something up, you don't need any verification, just make up a couple of stories and that will get the whole Parliament behind you. That's quite tempting, isn't it? Well, I think that's what's happened.
He screamed in my face several times. He told me that I was going to get cancer.
Okay, that allegedly happened in Glasgow. Do I believe it? No. I don't believe it at all. These people, they're never producing videos or anything like that. It's just a story made up and it grows arms and legs and it influences the MSPs. But anyway, let's press on and see what else they've got to say.
Implementing 150-metre buffer zones around abortion clinics would allow women and people who are pregnant to access the care they need.
Women and people who are pregnant? No. Women who are pregnant. There's no other sort of person who can be pregnant. But of course, this is a Green MSP and they live in gender fantasy land.
A poll conducted this year by the Scottish Humanists showed that 82% of Scots want to end targeted harassment outside abortion clinics.
Now, anyone thinking about saying that should realise that that's not really a convincing thing to say. A poll conducted by the Humanists, well, they've obviously got a very strong agenda, haven't they? But it says people are against targeted harassment. Well, of course people are against targeted harassment if you describe it as targeted harassment. So you're like giving away in your evidence that you're giving the fact that this poll was completely biased. But the MSP doesn't seem to see that.
Women who are already under immense pressure and about to go through an already traumatic process should not have to deal with anyone else's opinion.
That's interesting. Shouldn't have to deal with anyone else's opinion. Well, at least she's been honest. I mean, that is actually the issue. People object to have to become aware of someone else's opinion outside an abortion clinic. They're made aware that there's some people who are thinking this isn't actually the right thing to do and urging people to think again, not by speaking to them, but just by their presence is obviously going to communicate that message to people. So they shouldn't have to encounter other opinions. Well, in an open democratic society, I'm afraid that's life. You encounter people with different opinions and people can make you aware of their opinions in lots of different ways, and that's just something we have to live with.
However, I do not agree that an individual or group has the right to prevent someone from accessing a healthcare service.
Right, well, that's just completely irrelevant because no one has been prevented from accessing a service. You'd think they were like barricading the doors up or something. So again, total exaggeration, completely irrelevant comment. This is a Conservative MSP, by the way, one of the new Conservative MSPs.
Film individuals as they enter and leave the premise.
Again, I don't believe it. I do not believe that that's happened at these vigils. Evidence? No.
My body, my choice is something I have always agreed with, as I believe in freedom of choice.
Well, that's a real knockdown argument, isn't it? Because I believe in freedom of choice, then the child in the womb has no moral value. I mean, how can anyone even begin to present a little soundbite like that as though that's the fundamental justification for their view on a moral issue of huge weight? It's the Scottish Parliament.
To allow women to access services without feeling pressured by having to justify their decision.
They don't have to justify their decision. There's not someone there saying, you have to justify your decision. Why are you doing that? Because the people involved in the vigil don't approach anyone. It's only if someone chooses to go and talk to them that any sort of conversation takes place. So yet again, completely irrelevant, but...
This zoning would apply to both pro and anti-choice groups, which creates a fair balance on those on opposing sides of the debate.
I mean, really, come on. So the pro-life people want to have their presence at the abortion clinics. Sometimes pro-abortion people come along as well and sort of counter-protest or whatever you want to call it. So if you stop the pro-life vigil in the first place, they're saying that's fair because you're stopping the counter-demonstration. That's obviously not fair, because that's what the counter-demonstrators want. They want the pro-life presence removing. That's what they're demanding. That's why they're there. And so you're giving them their way. And if you can't see that that's not a neutral solution, well, it seems pretty obvious to me.
Those who seek to oppose a woman's right to make her own choice are not a new quantity by any means.
Right, so people who are against abortion are not a new quantity. I'm not sure what, that was maybe a slip of the tongue. I'm not sure what she was meaning to say. You're absolutely right, they're not new. Because throughout most societies, most of human history, abortion has been regarded as something that's wrong. So, I mean, she's quite right, I suppose, in that sense.
For decades and centuries, an ever-decreasing section of society has felt it incumbent on them to police women's decisions and indeed their bodies.
So she's saying there's been a pro-life movement for centuries trying to police women's bodies. I mean, the idea of abortion in Britain, abortion was only legalised in the 60s. So what she's talking about, this sort of pro-life movement for centuries, it's quite difficult to know what she's talking about. But let's carry on.
Fortunately, due to the efforts of so many brave individuals, in our own country at least, that grip has loosened to the point of being almost non-existent. But I only say almost because it is still there, and this is one very current and pernicious example.
So the pro-life voice, the pro-life influence is virtually non-existent, she says. Sadly, it's maybe not too far off the truth. We want to change that. Big time. We want to put abortion right at the top of the political agenda. But she's right. We've got a long way to go.
The groups behind them are often funded by highly questionable US-based pressure groups with a history of homophobia, sexism and indeed racism.
Evidence? Names? Which group? Which other group? Which funding groups? Now, I had a look on the internet. Now, normally, an organisation like 40 Days for Life that organises these vigils, you'd expect to find pretty easily on the internet a string of accusations against them. You'd expect on the Wikipedia page there'd be a controversies bit that's claiming they're funded by who knows who, Ku Klux Klan or whatever. I couldn't even find anything on the internet, not even, you know, some fierce opponent to the organisation making any similar allegations. So where this MSP gets this from, I really do not know. But as I say, this is the Scottish Parliament. You can just make these wild, unfounded claims and no one bats an eyelid.
It's almost unbearable to imagine how women feel when approached, harassed or intimidated by anti-choice protesters in these circumstances. But that is exactly what I would ask all members to do right now, to pause and just imagine exactly how this feels for women.
Yeah, we do need to imagine how it feels to be approached, harassed and intimidated. You need to imagine it because it doesn't really happen. This is only in people's imagination, harassment, being approached and intimidation. But again, the narrative just flows through the body of MSPs unchallenged, it seems. They just take the account from the campaigning group and take it at face value and recite it as though there's good evidence for it.
These are not reasonable expressions of free speech, and there's a difference between protest and harassment. just as there's a difference between free speech and misinformation.
Right, I'm not sure the connection between those two things. There's a difference between free speech and harassment. Well, that's not exactly a profound thing to say. That's obvious, isn't it? But the point is, there is no harassment. So what's happening here is they're taking free speech. It's not even speech. They're not even speaking. They've just been there. It's taking that and then saying it's harassment even though it isn't. And then saying, well, harassment isn't covered by free speech, therefore you're not allowed to do it. I mean, that's the argument, so-called, that's been put forward.
Protests can still be held, just not directly outside clinics. People can still contact their MSPs and share their beliefs. They have every right to do so. That's
an interesting one, isn't it? What do MSPs want, for example, pro-lifers? What do they want them to do? Do they want them to be campaigning? Do they want them to be putting abortion in the media debate and the public debate? Do they want them to be voting for parties that are pro-life? Dear me, no. They don't want any of those things. They want to keep a lid on pro-life activism. They want to tame them and basically render them ineffective. They want them just to be wasting their time. So what do they tell them to do? Write to the MSPs. Because they know that's not going to do anything. The MSPs are not going to change their mind. But if they can get the pro-life activists in Scotland just spending their time writing to MSPs, then that will sort of neutralise them. And this MSP is specifically recommending to pro-lifers that that's what they ought to do. I can see why.
Access to safe abortion healthcare is essential for the realisation of women's economic and social human rights.
Right, that's pretty clear. So you're saying abortion is necessary for economic reasons for a woman. So in order to earn as much money as you can at a certain point in her life, that means abortion is necessary. So killing the unborn child is justified on the grounds of making money.
They say that they are not trying to be intimidating. They are not intimidating, they will even state. Well, I'm sorry, but that is not for them to judge.
So who is to judge them? So if anyone declares, I am intimidated, then that is the objective truth on which decisions are made, is it? So if I say, Mr. Cole Hamilton, you're intimidating me with your speech, then that's for me to decide. And if he were to say, what? I'm not intimidating you. I'm just giving an ordinary speech in the Parliament. And I would say, it's not up to you to decide. It's up to me to decide if you're intimidating me or not. And I say you're intimidating me. Would he say, oh, OK, fair enough? Well, of course you wouldn't. You've got to judge intimidation by some sort of objective standard. You can't just rely on someone's report that they feel intimidated, especially if they're using this claim of intimidation in order to further their own agenda.
We know there are, of course, situations where those who are pregnant do change their mind about the procedure, but they deserve to be supported in that change of mind, in that reversal of decision, by staff who are trained to navigate the complexities surrounding pregnancy, not by those who want to impose their own personal opinion.
Now, that's a little bit like the conversion therapy ban line, isn't it? In other words, women who are thinking about abortion, even if they've decided not to have abortion, they shouldn't be cancelled by people who are pro-life. You just can't have that. They've got to be cancelled by people who are pro-abortion. That's the only way they can be properly looked after. So just like the conversion therapy ban.
And I realise that some would argue that men should not have an opinion on abortion and should not be speaking on anything related to abortion. And I might accept that if I was convinced that life begins at birth. But that is the key point, isn't it? When does life begin? Is it at birth? In which case we are talking solely about a woman's body and her right to choose whatever healthcare is necessary and suitable for her. Or does life begin at conception? In which case there are two lives from that point on, the mother's life and the baby's life. If that is the case, as I believe it is, then someone has a duty to speak up for the baby who has no voice.
That's John Mason. Let's let him continue.
So having been invited to visit such a gathering back in 2018, I attended one almost exactly 3 years ago outside the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Glasgow. There was nothing that could really be called a protest, in my opinion, and certainly nothing loud or aggressive or even close to harassment, intimidation or abuse. So I suppose my starting point would be, if there is not any real problem in Scotland, why would we need legislation? As I understand it, Police Scotland have been asked under Freedom of Information about whether there have been any incidents in Edinburgh or Glasgow. And apart from 2 incidents which they reported in September 2020 at the Chalmers Sexual Health Centre, when no action was taken, there appear to have been no serious problems in either city.
Right, so John Mason here is the sole MSP who's presenting the truth, basically, who's balancing things up. I would say, it's probably fair to say he's the only pro-life MSP in the Parliament. Now, there's some other MSPs who are, I would guess, do hold pro-life views, but John Mason is the only one who actually expresses them and makes some sort of effort to put it onto the agenda and to speak about it. So we applaud him for that. Obviously, as I've said before, the difference is that we would say the pro-life issue is so important that therefore you should support a party that's pro-life instead of being pro-life but then saying it's not a deal breaker, I'm still going to support the SNP. But what John Mason said there was absolutely spot on. Great. I mean, he'll get flack for it. There'll be snide newspaper articles about it, probably. Who knows what will happen within the SNP. In fact, we'll hear another SNP MSP responding to him in a minute in a pretty vicious fashion, frankly. Anyway, let's let John continue.
After coverage of this subject in the media a few weeks ago, one woman contacted me and I quote from her for the rest of my speech. Quote, "We are here for the women who are in their heart of hearts not at peace about going ahead with an abortion. They need a last-minute lifeline. Many women literally pray for a sign that they should keep their baby." She continues, "There are many women in this position, and I was one of them at the age of 20. These women often live with torment and regret for the rest of their lives. I have met one woman during the vigil in her 60s who said unequivocally that abortion had ruined her life. She has had 4 decades of trauma. Again, she says, I myself had 3 decades of various problems. My experience of the NHS was that as soon as I expressed doubt about going ahead with the pregnancy, I was put on a conveyor belt all the way to the termination. We really need to hear the other side of the debate in Parliament." Thank you.
Well, that was a little oasis of truth in the desert of sort of hysteria, exaggeration, fiction, etc. I mean, that does reflect actually what goes on at these vigils. So, well done, John. Thanks very much. And let's carry on to another MSP.
Harassment and intimidation and abuse is always unacceptable, but it is particularly vile at a time.
Absolutely. It's always unacceptable, but it doesn't happen. So you're saying vile. So you're talking to people like me, my wife, friends of mine, other people I know. A lot of these vigils, Catholics in particular, who are there. So you're describing their behaviour as vile. I think you've got to be on pretty strong ground and have checked your evidence very carefully before you start throwing words like that around. But again, it's all based on fiction. Because this abuse, harassment, etc. doesn't exist.
Women who experience multiple forms of discrimination may encounter harassment underpinned not only by sexism, but imbued by racism, ageism and ableism too.
The great thing with the philosophy of intersectionality is it enables you to contribute to any debate on any topic by just saying basically what about racism and sexism and ableism. You can just go through the sacred protected characteristics and it's as though you're making a really profound contribution to the debate.
Campaigners frequently carry materials directed at individual women, urging them to avoid abortion.
Wow, isn't that appalling? Carry materials, in other words, have in their pocket potentially a leaflet that encourages women to go ahead with their pregnancy rather than having an abortion. And if a woman came in and spoke to the people and it was appropriate in that conversation, they might offer one of those leaflets to the woman or to anyone else, I guess. Now, she's saying even the fact that they are in possession of such materials is a problem. It's like, you know, they have guns. She's treating it like that. This is a really sinister thing, that they will have a leaflet expressing a pro-life position.
We need to guarantee that people are free to make decisions at that time without harassment, coercion or intimidation.
Well, coercion. That's a new one. I don't think we've heard that one before. Again, utterly unjustified. There's nothing that remotely fits the definition of coercion in what's going on at these vigils.
We would not find it acceptable if people of colour in one part of Scotland were protected by anti-racist legislation, while people of colour in another part of Scotland were not.
All right, we're back to the Greens again. This is in response to the point where the government's saying that this should be done by councils. Individual councils should set up buffer zones where they're necessary. And her argument against that is that it would be like having protecting people from racism in some places and not in others. Again, that argument is so non-existent, I can't begin to analyse it because there's nothing to analyse. It's just a non-argument. But obviously, I mean, if you get racism in, that obviously makes it seem like you're the good person and the people you're against must be the bad people.
And such buffer zones will also allow healthcare professionals who work in these facilities, whether or not they have anything to do with abortion services, to go to and from their work without harassment, bullying or stigmatisation. That is a right which all workers should be able to rely on.
Harassment and bullying, well, they're not happening. Stigmatisation. Now, let's say that you work at the Fastlane nuclear submarine base and you've got CND protesters there every day. Does that stigmatise you, the fact that your job is working with nuclear weapons? Do you feel stigmatised? Do you feel judged? Well, yes, you would do. I mean, those people there, you know that they don't approve of your job. Does that mean that they shouldn't be there? Have you got a right to not be challenged about your job like that? Well, of course you don't. If people express the view to you that they disapprove of what you're doing in your job, again, bad luck. You know, open democratic society. If you're secure in your view that your job is the right thing to do, if your conscience is settled and you're happy doing it, then fine, you go ahead. If the people who are trying to challenge you about it, if their challenge actually hits home and you think, maybe I shouldn't be doing this, then think about a change. But the solution is not, shut these people up, I don't want to be challenged.
You don't have the right to scream in women's faces.
No, and no one has been either.
I just want to point out, first of all, that we're not here today to debate whether abortion should be available to people who want or need it. We're here to debate whether people who are exercising their right to choose and exercising their bodily autonomy should be able to do so without threat of harassment or abuse. That anyone would argue against that is abhorrent to me and frankly unforgivable.
Right, this is a new MSP, so from the Highlands and Islands, SNP. She seems to me to be extremely hardline. She uses quite, I would say, aggressive language, doesn't hold back, to say the least. And I would say that she's quite vicious towards the pro-life stance. You can see from what she's saying there. She said, we're not here to discuss abortion, but then the whole rest of what she had to say there was predicated on the belief that abortion is a fundamental right and no one dare disagree with it. Anyway, let's hear a bit more from the new MSP, Emma Roddick.
Clear that I have nothing but contempt for those who are loudly and unashamedly seeking to hijack it in order to pursue their agenda of placing my body and the bodies of others.
Right, hijack the debate. So I think she must be talking to John Mason. So she's got nothing but contempt for someone who's used this debate, well, not used it, has expressed a pro-life view within the debate. She's got nothing but contempt for them. I would say Emma Roddick is the future of the SNP. John Mason, I suspect, is coming towards the end of his career. But Emma Roddick, new blood coming in, this is the direction it's going. This did make me imagine, I wonder how many people in the Highlands and Islands thought, oh, Kate Forbes, I really like Kate Forbes, she's really nice, I'll vote SNP. This is who you got, Emma Roddick.
And I want to remind my SNP colleagues that we are a progressive social democratic party. I don't understand what social democracy means if it does not include defending reproductive rights.
You're right, you don't understand what social democracy means. I mean, what is undemocratic about being pro-life? I mean, social democracy, I mean, is allowing the killing of unborn children. Is that part of the fundamental definition of social democracy? Not in any understanding that I've come across. But again, notice that Emma here has been quite specific and saying to John Mason, what are you playing at? How dare you be in the SNP and express pro-life views? And she's expressing those views with far more venom than John Mason did. John Mason was very restrained, But she is not. She is really going for the jugular in response. As I say, we're seeing here a picture of the development of the SNP, where you've just got the final elements of pro-life, maybe heading towards the end of the career, and what you've got coming in is really hard-line pro-choice activism. Now, this is on this topic. I mean, let's see with Emma Roddick on other issues in the future. I expect we'll see a similar aggressive stance on a lot of other issues as well. Anyway, let's let it carry on.
Freedom of speech has been mentioned a lot in this debate, and it's an important concept, but dangerous if you don't understand what it means.
Okay, so I assume Emma is going to explain to us what freedom of speech means. This is going to be interesting, isn't it?
You are free to think what you like and speak up on your views on policy and protest government decisions, absolutely. But there's a difference between deciding abortion isn't for you and rocking up to a clinic to harass and judge those who chose differently. There is a difference between having personal views and showing up to Parliament as a legislator, seeking to restrict the freedom of others and prevent them from exercising freedom of choice. There's a difference between exercising your own personal freedom and restricting the ability of others to do the same.
Well, how about that then? Let's look at her definition of freedom of speech. People are absolutely free to think what they like. Oh, that's a relief. Thanks very much. To speak up on their views on policy and to protest government decisions. Okay, so far so good. However, there's a difference between deciding that abortion is not for you and rocking up to a clinic to harass and judge those who choose differently. Right, harass, again, that's not happening. Harassment's illegal in any context for any reason. So that's an irrelevant thing to bring up with regard to freedom of speech. But to judge those who choose differently. Now, the protesters are not speaking. I mean, they may be communicating by being there. Are they communicating a judgment? Very possibly. So she's saying freedom of speech doesn't include expressing judgment on other people's decisions. Right. I mean, that's just completely ridiculous. That's a crazy definition of freedom of speech. But anyway, let's carry on with what else she said, because it gets worse. There's a difference between having personal views and showing up to Parliament as a legislator seeking to restrict the freedom of others and prevent them from exercising freedom of choice. So she's saying it's okay to be pro-life, to have those beliefs, but if you're a politician, if you want to bring your views to the Parliament and express them in the Parliament and to campaign for them to be embodied in law, in other words, to restrict abortion legally, then that's not freedom of speech. Freedom of speech does not cover that. So you assume she thinks that should be illegal. So is she basically saying that what John Mason just said should be illegal? There shouldn't be freedom for him to say that. So she would be saying there shouldn't be freedom for the Scottish Family Party to exist. That's a major part of the reason why we exist, to bring in pro-life legislation. She's saying freedom of speech doesn't cover that. Now, I think what she's saying here, I mean, it's incoherent muddle. I mean, she basically doesn't know what she's talking about. But from what you can piece together of the way she thinks, it's extremely concerning. I think we've got here a radical sort of extremist, basically. Someone extremely intolerant of anyone who thinks differently than her. Anyway, she's in the SNP. So people in the Highlands and Islands, okay, if you're regretting voting for the SNP on the list, well, okay, vote for the Scottish Family Party next time.
However quietly they claim to pray, the act of praying at someone while they access health services, trying to persuade a stranger whose individual situation you know nothing about to carry a child because that's their purpose, is disgusting, however you spin it.
Praying at someone. So even though it's quiet, even though the prayer is not spoken out specifically at someone, just the fact that the people are praying there amounts to praying at people. Remember the conversion therapy committee? Again, this idea, prayer is dangerous and harmful. Praying at people. She's saying it like throw stones at people. And she says that is disgusting. She is disgusted that people pray among themselves at abortion clinics.
However, it is important that any action taken is proportionate and that it balances the ECHR rights of people accessing healthcare and of those people attending the vigils or protests.
Now here we've got Mary Todd, the government minister, replying to the debate. Now the SNP would love to bring in buffer zones. It's entirely on their wavelength. It would please their supporters. It would just be entirely on Nicola Sturgeon's wavelength. They want to do it. So why are they not doing it? And I think the reason is they're not sure they could get away with it legally. They think the human right, the right to express yourself, would be infringed for the people individual. So the Scottish government's worried if they pass a law saying no vigils outside abortion clinics, that could be appealed on the grounds of human rights and it will be overturned. It will be embarrassing for the government. So then the government's legal advice is you can't do it. So they're trying to say to councils, bring in bylaws, and they think councils might have a better chance because councils might be able to say, look, this is what's been happening at this particular clinic, and it might be a bit of a stronger case. So the SNP, I'm sure they would love to do it, and it's only because of legal concerns that they're not pushing right ahead.
But we also have to take into account that they are focused on a limited number of locations currently in Edinburgh and Glasgow, rather than affecting all abortion clinics in Scotland. So while we believe that buffer zones can be justified in certain circumstances, the Scottish Government doesn't consider that imposing blanket buffer zones around all abortion clinics would be appropriate.
Yeah, you see, she doesn't really emphasise the real reason, but that's what's going on. So there's going to be a tension here between a lot of the MSPs, a lot of campaigners who are demanding action, and the government who would love to meet their demands, but doesn't quite feel that they can. So it'll be interesting to see how this unfolds. I mean, this is going to be the last you'll hear of it for quite a while, I think. I don't think there are going to be any vigils for quite a while. I mean, this bill that's been put forward will take months and months to get anywhere. But it's fascinating to see, again, what's going on in the Scottish Parliament. I would re-emphasise what I said at the beginning. The new batch of MSPs that have come in, well, from the family party's point of view, I think they're going to push things even further in the wrong direction, which is a tragedy for Scotland. Politically, for the Scottish Family Party, it can be beneficial because the worse things get in the Parliament, the more of an opportunity that gives us to win support as people recognise how extreme and how misguided it's becoming in the Parliament. So yeah, I hope that was interesting. Do get your tickets for our conference. There's our link below. It'd be great to see you. That's Saturday the 13th of November in Dunfermline. You get your tickets via the link below. Okay, thanks for watching.